The rifle wasn't a military issue. It had no serial number stamped by an arsenal, no government inspection mark, and no connection to any quartermaster depot in the European theater. It was a hunting rifle, built for Montana deer and elk, with a polished walnut stock and a civilian telescopic sight. And in the frozen silence of a Belgian forest on January 18, 1945, it was the only thing standing between 200 advancing German soldiers and a field hospital filled with men too wounded to run. His name was Corporal Lyle Brandt. He was 22 years old. He had 37 rounds of ammunition, and the Germans had no idea he was there. The winter of 1945 in the Ardennes was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Snow piled waist-deep in the valleys. Soldiers froze to death in their foxholes. Weapons jammed. Vehicles wouldn't start. The forest itself became an enemy, dense and dark and suffocating, where visibility shrank to a few dozen yards and every sound was muffled by the weight of snow on the branches overhead. Hitler's last great gamble, the Ardennes offensive, had exploded across the Allied lines in mid-December with a ferocity that stunned even veteran commanders. Entire divisions had been shattered, supply lines severed, communication networks collapsed. The offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had driven a wedge deep into Belgium, creating pockets of chaos where American units were cut off, surrounded, or scattered into the wilderness. By January, the German advance had stalled, but scattered enemy units still roamed the forest, probing for weaknesses, hunting for targets, and try to link up with retreating elements of the Wehrmacht. Lyle Brandt had been swept up in the chaos like thousands of others. His unit, a rifle company attached to the 99th Infantry Division, had been holding a defensive position near the Aar River when the offensive began. The first wave of German artillery had been so sudden and so overwhelming that men barely had time to grab their rifles before the shells started landing. Trees exploded into splinters. Foxholes collapsed. The screaming started and didn't stop. Lyle's squad had been ordered to withdraw through the forest, but in the confusion of smoke and noise and terror, the platoon had fragmented. Men ran in different directions. Officers were killed. Radio operators lost their gear. Within an hour, Lyle was alone. He'd spent the next 3 days moving west through enemy territory, scavenging food from abandoned positions, avoiding German patrols, and trying to find friendly lines. He slept in snowdrifts. He drank from frozen streams. His M1 Garand rifle had jammed on the second day, foul with ice and mud, and he'd been carrying it as useless weight ever since. On the third day, stumbling through a ravine choked with blown-down trees, he found the wreckage of an American supply truck half buried in a snowbank. The truck had been hit by artillery or an airstrike. The cab was scorched black. The canvas cover over the bed had burned away. But inside, protected by a metal ammunition crate that had somehow survived intact, Lyle found a wooden shipping crate marked with civilian labels. Inside was a Remington Model 30 bolt-action rifle, a sporting model chambered in .30-06 Springfield, with a Lyman telescopic sight mounted on the receiver. Next to it was a box of hunting ammunition, soft-point cartridges designed for clean kills on large game. There were no markings to indicate why the rifle was there. No shipping orders. No name. It might have been a personal weapon being sent to an officer. It might have been seized from a Belgian farmhouse. It didn't matter. Lyle lifted the rifle out of the crate. The wood was smooth and oiled. The metal was cold but clean. The scope was undamaged. He worked the bolt. It cycled like silk, smooth and precise, with none of the military roughness of a mass-produced infantry rifle. He loaded 5 rounds into the internal magazine, closed the bolt, and slung the rifle over his shoulder. His Garand went into the snow. He took the rest of the ammunition, 42 rounds total, and kept moving. By the morning of January 18th, Lyle had made his way to a ridge overlooking a narrow dirt road that ran through a valley between 2 forested hills. He knew the road. He'd seen it on maps during pre-deployment briefings. It was a secondary supply route used by American engineers to move equipment and wounded men back toward the rear. More importantly, it led directly to a field hospital near the village of Hansfeld, a cluster of canvas tents and wooden structures set up in a clearing less than 2 miles down the valley. The hospital was still operating. Lyle had passed close enough the previous night to hear the hum of generators and see the glow of oil lamps through the canvas. There were medics there, doctors, nurses, wounded men on stretchers who couldn't be moved quickly. And that morning, just after first light, Lyle saw the Germans. They came in column formation, moving with the disciplined confidence of veteran infantry. Over 200 men, he estimated, spread out in tactical intervals along the roadway. 2 SDKFZ 251 half-tracks led the advance, their armor hulls painted in winter camouflage, turrets scanning the tree line. Behind them came a Panzer IV medium tank, its long 75mm gun traversing slowly from side to side. Motorcycle scouts ranged ahead, engines sputtering in the cold. Officers walked among the ranks, shouting orders, keeping the formation tight. They moved like men who believed the road was clear, like men who had no reason to expect resistance. Lyle was 700 yards upslope, concealed behind a fallen spruce tree and a ridge of snow-covered earth. He climbed the ridge in the pre-dawn darkness, digging a shallow scrape in the frozen ground with his trench knife and covering himself with a section of torn camouflage netting he'd scavenged from the wrecked truck. The position gave him a clear line of sight down the length of the road. The wind was blowing west-east, directly into his face, carrying sound away from the Germans. The temperature was hovering just below zero. His breath came in short, controlled puffs that he forced downward into his collar to avoid visible vapor. His hands were wrapped in wool gloves with the right trigger finger cut away. His face was numb. His feet had lost feeling an hour ago. He watched the column through the Lyman scope. The optics were clear and bright, far superior to the iron sights on his Garand. He could see individual faces. He could read rank insignia. He could count ammunition pouches and identify weapon types. The Germans were relaxed. Some were smoking. A few were talking, their voices faint and muffled by distance. They had no idea anyone was watching. Lyle counted them twice. 230 men, maybe more in the rear of the column. If they continued down that road unchallenged, they would reach the field hospital in 18 minutes. There were no defensive positions between here and there, no roadblocks, no minefields, no prepared fallback points. The hospital staff had maybe a dozen rifles among them, carried by walking wounded and rear echelon clerks. Against 200 Germans with armor support, they wouldn't last 5 minutes. Lyle's orders, if he'd had any, would have been to withdraw, to avoid engagement, to find friendly lines and report the enemy's position. One man could not stop a company. That was doctrine. That was training. That was the basic arithmetic of war. 1 rifle against 200 was suicide. But Lyle Brandt had grown up on a ranch in Montana where winter lasted 6 months and help was 50 miles away. He'd learned to shoot because wolves didn't care if you were alone. He'd learned patience because elk didn't give second chances. He'd learned that sometimes the line you were standing on was the only line there was, and if you didn't hold it, no one would. He didn't think about heroism. He didn't think about medals or glory or any of the words that would be used later. He thought, if I don't, they're dead. He settled the Remington into his shoulder, feeling the walnut stock press against the hollow of his collarbone. He adjusted the scope, sending the crosshairs on the lead motorcycle scout, a young German soldier in a field-gray greatcoat with machine pistol slung across his chest. The range was 680 yards. The wind was steady at 4 miles per hour, left to right. He adjusted for windage, breathing in the frozen air, slowing his heart, letting the world narrow down to the space between the crosshairs and the target. He exhaled halfway, held it, squeezed. The Remington cracked, sharp and clean, the report echoing across the valley like the snap of a breaking branch. Through the scope, Lyle saw the German scout's head snap back in a red mist. The man tumbled sideways off his motorcycle, limbs loose, already dead. The bike veered into a ditch and crashed. The sound of the shot reached the column a half-second later. Shouting erupted. Officers barked commands. Soldiers dove off the road, scrambling for cover behind trees and snowbanks and the armor hulls of the half-tracks. Lyle worked the bolt. Smooth, mechanical, no wasted motion. A spent brass casing ejected, tumbling into the snow beside him. He He chambered another round, the soft-point bullet sliding home with a metallic click. He scanned the column through the scope, searching for the next target. An officer stood near the lead half-track, gesturing wildly, trying to organize a response. Lyle placed the crosshairs on the man's chest. Squeezed. The officer went down, collapsing into the snow without a sound. Another shout. More confusion. The Germans still couldn't locate him. 700 yards with a scoped rifle in a concealed position was beyond their immediate visual range. They were trained to respond to machine gun fire, to mortar impacts, to the chaos of close-range ambushes, not to invisible, precise shots from a ridgeline. They couldn't even see clearly. They fired blindly into the trees. Rifles cracked. A machine gun opened up, spraying rounds into the forest 200 yards below Lyle's position. The Panzer IV's turret swung toward the ridge, but the gunner had no target. They were shooting at ghosts. Lyle fired again. A sergeant crouching behind the second half-track, trying to set up a radio. Down. Another bolt cycle. Another target. A soldier attempting to assemble a tripod-mounted MG-42 machine gun. Down before the weapon was even locked into place. The soft-point hunting rounds, designed to expand on impact and deliver maximum energy to the target, were devastatingly effective against unarmored infantry. Every hit was catastrophic. Every man who fell stayed down. The German column began to fracture. Soldiers huddled behind whatever cover they could find, refusing to move, refusing to expose themselves. Officers screamed orders that went unheeded. A mortar team tried to set up on the roadway, but Lyle put a round through the gunner's chest before the tube was even armed. The assistant gunner grabbed the mortar and tried to drag it off the road. Lyle shot him through the shoulder. The man dropped the tube and crawled into the ditch, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. The Panzer IV fired. The 75 mm gun roared, the muzzle blast kicking up a cloud of snow and dirt. The shell screamed over Lyle's position and detonated 200 yards behind him, shredding trees and throwing up frozen earth. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that slammed into his chest and left his ears ringing. But the shot was blind. The tank crew had no idea where he was. They were firing at sound, at guesswork, at desperation. Lyle ignored the tank. Armor was a problem he couldn't solve with a hunting rifle. But the infantry around it, the men trying to organize a response, the spotters trying to direct return fire, those he could kill, and he did. He targeted a soldier climbing a tree, trying to get a better vantage point. The man made it 15 feet up before Lyle's bullet punched through his spine. He fell, hitting branches on the way down, and landed in a heap at the base of the trunk. He targeted a radio man crouched behind a tree, frantically speaking into a handset, probably calling for artillery or air support. The man's head snapped forward, and the radio fell silent. He targeted an officer attempting to rally a squad for a flanking maneuver, pointing toward a ridge and shouting. The officer dropped mid-sentence. Lyle's hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. The cold had stopped bothering him. The fear had stopped bothering him. There was only the rhythm. Locate, breathe, squeeze, cycle, repeat. He'd fired 17 rounds. He had 20 left. Every shot had to count. By the 20th minute, the German advance had completely stalled. Bodies lined the roadway. Wounded men screamed for medics who were too terrified to move. Officers no longer stood upright. The half-tracks had reversed 50 yards up the road, trying to get out of the kill zone, but they were still within range. Lyle put a round through the vision slit of the lead half-track. He didn't know if he hit anyone inside, but the vehicle stopped moving and didn't start again. Some of the Germans tried to charge the ridge. A dozen men broke cover and sprinted upslope, firing as they ran, screaming to keep their courage up. Lyle dropped the first man at 600 yards, the second at 550, the third at 500. The rest broke and ran back to the road, diving into ditches and behind fallen logs. Two didn't make it. One tried to surrender, raising his hands and shouting in German. Lyle hesitated. For 3 seconds, he hesitated. Then he saw movement behind the man. Another soldier raising a rifle, using the surrender as a distraction. Lyle shot the one with the rifle first. Then the one with his hands up, he felt nothing. There was no room for feeling, only for shooting. The Panzer IV fired again, this time at a different section of the ridge, but still blind. The shell impacted harmlessly into the hillside, shaking the ground but doing no damage. Lyle had shifted position twice during the engagement, crawling laterally along the ridgeline to avoid being pinpointed by sound. The snow helped. The dense tree cover helped. And the sheer impossibility of what he was doing helped most of all. The Germans were looking for a platoon, a machine gun nest, an anti-tank team. They weren't looking for one man with a deer rifle. Lyle was down to 14 rounds. He chose his targets with surgical care now. A spotter trying to use binoculars. Down. An officer attempting to coordinate a withdrawal. Down. A soldier dragging a wounded comrade off the road. Lyle hesitated again. Then he fired. The man dragging fell. The wounded man lay still. War had no mercy. War didn't care about intentions. The retreat began just after the 30th minute. It wasn't organized. It wasn't tactical. It was a rout. The half-tracks gunned their engines in reverse at full speed, spewing black smoke, turret silent. Infantry broke cover and ran, abandoning weapons, leaving wounded, throwing away helmets and backpacks to move faster. The Panzer IV fired one last blind shot, then ground into reverse, its treads churning snow and mud, its gun still searching for a target it would never find. Within 5 minutes, the road was empty except the dead and the dying. Lyle counted 31 bodies visible from his position, for more were obscured by terrain or dragged partway into the tree line. He estimated another dozen wounded who'd been pulled back during the retreat. The road was littered with discarded equipment, rifles, ammunition belts, medical kits, helmets. A motorcycle lay on its side. Front was still spinning slowly. Lyle stayed in position for another 40 minutes, watching through the scope, scanning for movement, waiting for a counterattack that never came. His body was shaking now, not from fear but from adrenaline crash and cold. His fingers were numb despite the gloves. His shoulders ached from holding the rifle. His eyes burned from staring through the scope without blinking. But the road was clear. The hospital was safe. He gathered the spent shell casings, 32 of them, and pocketed them out of habit. His father had taught him never to waste brass. He took one last look down the valley, then crawled backward off the ridge, staying low, moving slowly, leaving no silhouette against the sky. It took him 3 hours to reach friendly lines. He stumbled into an American checkpoint just after noon, manned by a mix of combat engineers and rear echelon infantry, who'd been scraped together into a makeshift defensive line. They stared at him like he was a ghost. He was covered in snow. His face was gray with cold. His uniform was torn. He was carrying a rifle they didn't recognize. He told them what he'd done. They didn't believe him. One rifleman stopping the company? Impossible. Shock, confusion, exhaustion talking. But he insisted. He gave them the coordinates. He described the column, the vehicles, the bodies. A lieutenant finally sent a patrol up the road to investigate. They came back 2 hours later. Silent. Shaken. They'd found the carnage. 35 confirmed dead. Abandoned vehicles. Bloodstains in the snow stretching for half a mile. Shell casings. Evidence of massacre delivered with precision. Word spread fast. Within a day, Lyle Brandt's name was moving through the ranks. The rifleman who'd held a line alone. The man who'd stopped the company with a hunting rifle. Command didn't know what to do with him. He'd done something outside doctrine, outside training, outside the normal logic of war. Intelligence officers questioned him. Ballistics experts examined the Remington. War correspondents wanted interviews. Lyle refused most of them. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a soldier who'd done what needed doing because there was no one else there to do it. When pressed, he said only. They were going to kill a lot of people who couldn't fight back. I had a rifle. I used it. The field hospital he'd saved treated over 300 wounded men in the weeks following the engagement. Doctors, nurses, medics. None of them knew his name at the time. They only knew that the expected German assault never came, that the road stayed clear, that they had time to evacuate critical cases and reinforce their position before the next German probe. Lyle Brandt was pulled off the line in early February, not for decoration. Though a Silver Star was eventually awarded in a ceremony, he didn't attend, not for promotion, but because command had no idea what to do with a soldier who became a legend by accident. He spent the rest of the war in a training depot in France, teaching marksmanship to replacement troops. He hated it. He wanted to go back to his unit, back to the line, but the decision wasn't his to make. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Lyle returned to Montana in late summer, took his discharge at Fort Lewis, and went back to the ranch where he'd grown up. He never kept a Remington. It had been confiscated for inspection and logged into some quartermaster depot, probably destroyed as surplus or sold at auction years later. He didn't care. It had done its job. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, worked the ranch until his back gave out in his 60s. He rarely spoke about the war. His children knew he'd been in Belgium, knew he'd been in combat, but he never told them the details. It wasn't until the 1980s, when a local newspaper ran a story about forgotten World War II veterans, that the full account of the stand began to surface publicly. The story might have remained a footnote, a minor anecdote in a sprawling global conflict, except for a detail that emerged decades later. In 1987, a German veteran named Klaus Zimmermann published a memoir titled Schnee und die Schatten, Snow and Shadows, chronicling his experiences during the Ardennes Offensive. Zimmermann had been a lieutenant in a reconnaissance battalion tasked with probing American positions in the Our River Valley in January 1945. In one chapter, he described an advance down a forest road that ended in catastrophe. He wrote, **, we moved with confidence that morning. The road was clear. Intelligence had reported no American forces in the sector. We were to link up with elements of the 6th Panzer Army and secure a supply route. Then the shooting started. We never saw the shooter. We fired at the ridge, at the trees, at shadows. We used smoke. We called in armor. Nothing worked. Men died one by one, and we could not stop it. I have fought in Poland, France, Russia. I have seen terrible things. But I have never felt more helpless than I did on that road. It was as if the forest itself had decided to kill us. Precision, patience, cruelty. We retreated in shame. Later, we heard rumors. 1 American, 1 rifle. I did not believe it then. I am not sure I believe it now, but I have no other explanation. *, Zimmermann's account confirmed what American after-action reports had documented but never fully explained. A single engagement, a single rifleman, 37 rounds fired, 35 confirmed kills. An entire company stopped cold. What made Lyle Brandt different? He wasn't Special Forces. He wasn't a trained sniper. He'd never attended advanced marksmanship school or worked with specialized equipment. He didn't have a spotter, a radio, air support, or an extraction plan. He had skill, yes. Thousands of soldiers had skill. He had a good rifle, yes. But a good rifle doesn't stop 200 men. What made the difference was something harder to define. It was mindset. Lyle had been raised in a world where responsibility couldn't be passed to someone else because there was no one else. Where winter didn't care about your fear or your excuses. Where survival meant doing the hard thing, alone, without recognition or backup. His father had taught him to shoot, but Montana had taught him to endure, to hold the line, to refuse to break. The Army had given him discipline. Montana had given him resolve, where it had given him a moment where both were required at the same time. And he hadn't flinched. Modern military doctrine has studied engagements like Lyle's extensively. Precision engagement, force multiplication, psychological disruption, the ability of a single skilled shooter to inflict disproportionate casualties and disrupt enemy operations far beyond the raw numbers. Today, trained snipers routinely engage targets at distances exceeding 1,000 yards, using advanced optics, ballistic computers, and suppressed rifles. But they do so with support, with spotters, with communication, with extraction plans. Lyle had none of that. He had 37 bullets and the belief that the people behind him mattered more than the odds in front of him. In 1995, at the age of 72, Lyle Brandt gave one of his few extended interviews to a military historian researching small unit actions during the Battle of the Bulge. The historian asked him if he'd been afraid that day on the ridge. Lyle thought for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Yeah, I was afraid." Anybody who says they're not afraid in a situation like that is either lying or crazy. But fear doesn't change what needs doing. You do the thing or you don't. I did. That's all. The historian pressed him, asked him if he'd thought about the men he was killing, if he'd felt guilt or regret. Lyle's answer was blunt. "I thought about the men in the hospital, the ones who couldn't run, the medics, the nurses. That's who I was thinking about. The Germans made their choice when they started down that road. I made mine. I don't lose sleep over it." That answer, stripped of drama, stripped of morality, captures something essential about the kind of person who can hold a line alone. It's not about fearlessness. It's not about righteousness. It's about refusal. Refusal to abandon the post. Refusal to accept the inevitable. Refusal to let the weight of impossible odds dictate the outcome. Lyle Brandt died in April 1998 at the age of 75 on the same Montana ranch where he'd spent almost his entire life. He suffered a stroke while repairing fence line and was gone before the ambulance arrived. He was buried in a small cemetery overlooking the valley in a plot next to his wife, who had passed 2 years earlier. The funeral was attended by family, neighbors, and a handful of veterans from the local VFW post. There were no military honors. He'd requested none. The only marker on his grave was a simple granite headstone with his name, his dates, and a single line he'd chosen himself. Asterisk, he held the line. Asterisk, the Remington Model 30 was never recovered. If it still exists, it's buried in a military archive somewhere. Serial number lost. Significance unknown. But the legacy of that rifle isn't in wood and metal. It's in the lives it saved. The medics who survived to treat wounded men. The nurses who went home after the war. The soldiers who were evacuated from that hospital and lived to see their families again. Every one of them owed their survival to 37 bullets fired by a man they never met. War is most often remembered in terms of grand strategy, sweeping offensives, decisive battles that changed the course of history. Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. But most of war is smaller than that. A single road, a single position, a single decision made by a single soldier who refuses to let the moment pass without action. Those moments don't always make it into the official histories. They don't always earn monuments or parades. But they matter. They change outcomes. They save lives. And sometimes they remind us that the difference between disaster and survival can be measured in the resolve of one person who decides that impossible is just a word. Lyle Brandt never called himself a hero. He never claimed to have done anything extraordinary. To him, it was simple arithmetic. There was a problem. He had a solution. He used it. That pragmatic, unromantic mindset, more than any tactical brilliance or physical courage, is what made his stand possible. He didn't think about glory or legacy. He thought about the hospital, about the wounded men who couldn't defend themselves, about the doctors and nurses who would die if the Germans made it through. And he decided that if he could buy them time, even at the cost of his own life, he would. It didn't cost him his life, but it could have. And he went anyway. The lesson isn't that one person can always win. The lesson is that one person in the right place, with the right preparation and the right refusal to yield, can change the equation, can turn the impossible into the improbable, can hold a line long enough for others to survive. Lyle Brandt held that line, alone, with a rifle that wasn't supposed to be there, against an enemy that should have overwhelmed him. And he won, not because he was invincible, not because the universe owed him victory, but because he refused to lose. That refusal, that cold-eyed, stubborn, unshakable refusal to let the line break, is the rarest and most valuable quality a soldier can possess. More valuable than armor, more powerful than numbers, more enduring than firepower. It's the thing that makes the difference when everything else has failed. It's the reason why, 80 years after that frozen morning in Belgium, we still tell Lyle Brandt's story, because it reminds us that the line, whatever it is, wherever it is, however impossible it seems to hold, only holds if someone decides to hold it. Lyle decided, And the line held. And because of that, hundreds of people lived who would have died. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. Not the medals or the headlines or the historical footnotes. Just a simple, brutal, beautiful fact that one man, with one rifle, refused to let the impossible be the final answer. If you want more real stories like this, subscribe now and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from?